Hello there, good morning. It's 10 o'clock, and welcome back to another edition of Front Page with me, Noah Keate. This is a space where every week I like to reflect on the world events that have defined the world in which we live and how we shape our lives, and the different events taking place that really impact what we do and almost what we're not doing in these lockdown times. I also will speculate on what I think could happen in the future and really try to take a look at how what's happened in the past, whether it's in the last week, in the last month, or in the last year, how that will affect what happens in the future and how time develops. I'll also offer my cultural recommendations of what I think is worth reading, whether it's the best book of the week, my podcast of the week, or my tweeter of the week, someone who I think deserves a follow on Twitter. And I'll take a look through all the front pages, whether it's the tabloids or the broadsheets. I'll have a look through what the papers do and don't reveal about the world in which we live, what they tell us about what's going on in the UK and internationally. So I do hope you'll get involved. I can't promise I'll be right or wrong about what I'm saying. I like to think I'm correct in what I think, but it's never possible that there might be some inaccuracies. I like to try and base what I think off the facts, but it's always possible that you might have another view. So do get involved, whether it's commenting on the Facebook page or YouTube channel. I'd love to hear what you think about what we're talking about, to make sure I can see all your comments, and I'll make sure I read them out. And it'd be lovely to hear what you have to say about what's going on in the world, because we all have our own different opinions. Normally in the workplace, it might be in the lift as you're going up to your office, or as you're on your way to a seminar. You might have a chance to talk with friends about what you think about what's going on in the news. But now we're no longer seeing as many people. We've had little choice but to move those thoughts online and be on social media all the time, displaying our views. So I'd love to have your involvement over this next hour, getting involved in what you think about the news stories that I'm going to be discussing today. I'm afraid it will be mainly coronavirus related. I tried to, when I was doing my research, look for some non-coronavirus related topics, but I'm afraid predominantly it's going to be based on coronavirus. But one of the good things about coronavirus is that there are so many different angles from which to approach the story, and so that's how I really want to follow the story today, looking at the different bits that might not receive so much discussion in the news. I know predominantly in the news it's based around day-to-day testing and PPE equipment, all of which are hugely important, as well as the tragic daily death tolls. But I like to take a look at some of the different angles of how coronavirus has affected our lives and how it might do in the future. So I'm going to get started in a minute, but I remember from last week, you might remember in my first edition, I wanted to do something that I didn't end up doing in the show, and that was a time check. I listened to the radio a lot, and a key part of the radio is doing a time check. So I'm going to look, it's 3 minutes past 10. You're watching Front Page with me, Noah Keate, here on the Raw News Facebook page and YouTube channel. I'll try and remember to do those time checks throughout the hour. Either will or either won't, but I knew I wanted to do one when the programme began. And I want to start today by talking about the importance of accountability and responsibility. And it's something, accountability, that's a part of all of our lives, whether it's how a child does at school, whether it's a healthcare issue, claiming a benefit, or receiving justice from the criminal justice system. That's what it's called. Accountability is a key part of the way in which we get engaged within society. If something goes wrong, we want to know why it's gone wrong, ensure that it doesn't go wrong again, and ensure that if people are responsible, they're held to account, their actions are scrutinised, and they receive the appropriate sanction or punishment, and ensure that that acts as a deterrent against other people. And I think this is especially important during the coronavirus, specifically that governments are held accountable for the actions that they're taking, whether in the UK or around the rest of the globe. It's important that citizens and the media and politicians are scrutinising those with power over the decisions they make. But that hasn't been so well received from the public. I think from the public, there's been a real sense of unifying around the government, particularly in the UK. Boris Johnson's or the Conservative Party's opinion poll ratings have never been higher. I saw one yesterday that was put the Conservatives as being over 50% in the polls. And that's usually the case in times of crisis and lockdown, a pandemic, a terrorist attack, an awful event. There's usually a sense of citizens rallying behind the government in trying to create some sort of unity within the country. Because I think they're trying, what these polls show is that whatever divisions there are within the country, there's a sense of unity against an enemy. I remember, well, I don't remember because I was 1 month old, but after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the opinion poll ratings for George Bush, who was then US president, had never been higher. They were about 80-90%, because Americans, despite many Democrats being opposed to the policies he was enacting, they were united behind him and the American government in opposing Al-Qaeda and those that had committed the atrocities of 9/11. And we're certainly seeing that in the UK, and other governments generally around the world are seeing their polling ratings go up as citizens want to unite behind them. And this can make accountability and scrutiny quite difficult. I know there will be accountability in the future. I don't know how many times I'll end up saying the word future in this episode, but it's something I like to think about generally, as well as the importance of the present and the past. There'll be a big inquiry in the UK, that's almost certain. Boris Johnson's government will have its Chilcot moment, and the Chilcot inquiry, of course, refers to the investigation into the Iraq War and the actions that Tony Blair's government took. There will be at least one of those, I'm sure, just as there was a Grenfell inquiry after the horrific fire in the Tower Block in Kensington. I wouldn't be surprised if there were almost multiple inquiries into the government's handling of the coronavirus pandemic, because there are simply so many angles for them to look at, whether it's how the Home Office responds to increases in domestic violence, or how the NHS responds to dealing with these extra patients, how the Department for Work and Pensions responded to people needing benefit, or even international trade, the Foreign Office, how our relationships with other parts of the world were affected. There are so many different angles for an inquiry and a government response to look at that I wouldn't be surprised if there were multiple investigations into how the government behaved and whether it behaved correctly or whether its response was wrong. And that's important. That's something that will happen in the future post the pandemic. I don't know whether coronavirus will be something that stays with us for the long term, like the flu, and whether it's simply something that we're going to have to get used to, even if it's not on the scale that it currently has been in the UK and around the rest of the globe. But at some point, there will need to be a look into what the government has done. And this can make it tricky to scrutinise and hold account the government and criticise the government during the pandemic itself, because you're seen almost to be against the government. It's like if you're somewhat critical of what they do, it's as though you're supportive of the pandemic and the awfulness that is spread around the country. And of course, that's not the case. Of course, nobody likes the pandemic. Everyone wants it to go away as soon as possible. But it's part of wanting to go away that we must hold the government responsible for what they do. And so it's sort of so wide-ranging the areas in which we can look at the government. And this is particularly important for politicians. What we've seen in the last couple of weeks, the reopening of Parliament at Prime Minister's question sessions, select committee sessions taking place via Zoom, where MPs and those who are devoted to helping constituents and holding the government to account have been able to probe ministers about the actions they've been taking. So I know the Home Affairs Select Committee, for example, was probing and questioning the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, over her response to the coronavirus pandemic and how the Home Office are looking at helping people and ensuring that the police and other bodies are helping people in the way that they need to. And this is really important for Keir Starmer as Labour leader. He is the leader of the opposition. With that comes, I think, a nice car, a nice office, and extra pay. And he needs to use this responsibility to ensure that the government are sort of held accountable with their feet to the fire, and they're not simply allowed to get away with any policy at all, because that wouldn't be wise either in the present or in the future when looking back on this issue. And I think it's been hard for Labour to be a proper official opposition over the last 5 years. Certainly when Jeremy Corbyn was in charge, there was very much the sense that he was dealing more with infighting in his own party rather than opposing the Conservative Party and the actions that they were taking. And quite logically, nobody votes for a party that's divided. While there will always be internal divisions within the party, you want to present an image to the rest of the country of being united and ready to take on government. And that was never the case with Jeremy Corbyn and what his comrades were able to do. Even in 2017, while they clearly did better than expected, they were nowhere near the process of forming a government. And that's been the same with, well, that's what Keir Starmer is trying to differentiate himself from, even though he was in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. As leader of the opposition, he's trying to present a more united front in what he does. And I think he's doing well so far in trying to present a nuanced take to accountability. He's saying that we will hold the government accountable where they're doing things wrong. And he's certainly done this in his Prime Minister's question session with Dominic Raab, who's been stepping in for Boris Johnson, asking about the number of testing and trying to ensure that issues that the public care about are raised in what the government have to hear. But he's saying that they won't just oppose for opposition's sake. And I think that's really important to manage. A government and the public will not like a party that simply try to be rude about the government or dismissive of any government action simply because they're from a different party. And I think that will both win over support with the public, but also more importantly is simply the right thing to do. There's a real balance to take, and it's almost as though he's been able to act in a prime ministerial fashion, which is what any good leader of the opposition wants to be. It's very hard to transfer from being leader of the opposition to then being prime minister, and I think Keir Starmer has managed that well, and it seems to be a reflector of what the public want. But there must be the chance to say that the government have done things wrong, and the public shouldn't be afraid of that. And that's been a part of some of the key debate with daily media press conferences that the government hold, normally with the banner saying, stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. Now, I have to admit, I don't watch these press conferences. I prefer personally trying not to, even though I'm on Raw News here, I try not to look at an overwhelming amount of news. I try to stagger the news I receive from Twitter and reliable people that I follow on Twitter, as well as looking on websites like the BBC and The Guardian. But there has been some criticism in how journalists questions the government via Zoom through phoning in to questioning the minister that's speaking that day and how they're holding the government to account. And I think from journalists, just from MPs and Keir Starmer, there needs to be a real balance between what journalists want to find out. And they shouldn't simply be looking for a scoop, a way to try and catch the government out or show that the government have failed in some way. They should be asking the question that their readers or their listeners or their viewers want to hear. And that will probably more likely be about practical day-to-day actions and what people can do to protect themselves and ensure that the lockdown will gradually be eased and that people can live a more fulfilling quality of life. But at the same time, journalists should be able to say when the government have done something wrong. If the government have announced something and it's incorrect or misleading, journalists should be able to point that out and they shouldn't be scrutinised for doing so. It's not the role of journalists or any sort of commentator to support the government. It's the role to ensure that that they publish things that the government that are accurate, that are correct, that are truthful, but the government might not necessarily want people to hear about. And so just because we're in a time of a pandemic and a national crisis doesn't suddenly mean that scrutiny, democracy and opposition don't go away. I think that's why it was right that Keir Starmer didn't ever join. I don't know if it was seriously proposed, but Keir Starmer never joined a government of national unity. I think it was right in the sense that an opposition does remain. And I think if he had joined a government of national unity, that would have reduced the level of discussion and communication taking place, and that probably would have narrowed the range of ideas that were around the cabinet table, wherever they have their meetings. And so by having an opposition that's separate, that's departed from the government itself, that ensures that the government knows that they can't simply get away with things. Of course, Boris Johnson can pretty much do what he likes over the next 4 years. He has a majority of 80. But that doesn't mean an opposition simply becomes irrelevant. And in the inquiry, when they look back on who said what and who did what, it will be important that Keir Starmer and any people that aren't in the actual government, so that they can say that they got involved and that they ensured that people were responding to what the government did, as well as holding the government accountable when they did something wrong. And this isn't just the case in the UK. You see this in press conferences all around the world. The only other memorable one that I can really think of is journalists investigating and holding Donald Trump to account, and his press conferences are almost beyond parody. I mean, what is there to say? Let's have my first tea of the day, my lovely mug. What is there left to say about what Donald Trump has been doing? It's almost like, I feel deeply sorry for satire magazines like Private Eye, who are built on writing about half of their magazine as things that are truthful and things that we don't know about, and the other half is just jokes and things that politicians would never actually say. Well, you could imagine politicians saying them, but they'd never actually say them. And for Donald Trump to recommend that people injected themselves or had disinfectant inserted into their lungs, it just blows, it blows my mind. I just can't, it sort of can't compute. Even after everything that Donald Trump has said in the past, I still wouldn't have believed that this would be something that he'd actually say. And so it just shows how journalists have had to be responsible in holding him to account and saying why he's wrong and why he's not correct in the American response to dealing with the crisis. I think it's important that Donald Trump is held accountable, and it's almost in a completely different context in America compared to the rest of the UK, partially because there is an election on. It's almost a sign of, we should be quite relieved that we've had the pandemic after an election. The fact that there's an election coming up in America has completely changed the aspect and attitude of the key players towards the crisis. In terms of Joe Biden, even though it's clear that he'll now be the challenger to Donald Trump, there still isn't very little clarity about his direction and showing proper leadership. And from Donald Trump, he's now gradually saying that the lockdown should be eased and states are beginning to reopen. This is despite America having the highest number of cases in the world, thousands of deaths, and tens of millions applying for unemployment benefit, which is just remarkable in America. And part of me was wondering, the areas that have been most affected in America and indeed the rest of the world are urban areas. This is quite understandable. In urban areas, it's more congested. People are more likely to be nearer to each other. There are going to be more shops and more chances of communication. So hence you've seen places like Los Angeles and New York City be far more affected than, say, rural areas in the Midwest. I mean, of course, there'll still be cases, but they're far less likely to be affected. And so part of me wonders whether Donald Trump is almost more relaxed about the coronavirus pandemic and the number of deaths simply because they're more likely to affect areas, urban areas, that didn't exactly support him in the last election, have never really supported Republicans and are unlikely to support him in the next election. So that might just be me being deeply cynical, even more cynical about Donald Trump. But I wouldn't be surprised if some of his framing around the coronavirus pandemic was affected by the fact that areas that are less affected by coronavirus are more likely to be ones that support him. But as I say, the key points from this section is accountability and scrutiny. They don't go away. They don't go away during war times, and they shouldn't go away during a pandemic. And we shouldn't be afraid to have politicians and journalists being critical of the government and saying uncomfortable things that the government might not want people to know about, but have to be said if we're to live in a proper liberal democracy, because we can't allow that to be thrown away during a pandemic. Now, I'd love to see some of your comments. You might agree with what I've said, or you might completely disagree with me. You might think that opposition now is not the right thing to do, that people should be fully supportive of the government, or you might be rather indifferent to any of the remarks I've made. But whatever your view, do let me know. I'd love to hear your views and comments. So either comment on the Facebook page or YouTube channel, and your comments should flash up on the screen. I'd love to have a read of them and hear what you have to say. The CMP Movies says there have been very successful critiques of the government now, principally a Sunday Times report. Well, yes, I remember talking about this on another Raw News show, the sense that 38 days were lost because of government inaction. Certainly Boris Johnson not attending COBRA meetings, almost being on holiday for longer than he should have, and us, the UK, sending PPE equipment to China, which, given we didn't have that much ourselves, didn't seem the wisest of moves. So you're right, there have been critiques from the Sunday Times. Interestingly, the Sunday Times, a Brexit supporting paper, certainly supportive of Boris Johnson at the last election. So it's interesting how their editorial stance, while they might still support the Conservatives, they've been willing to be critical of the government. And I think that's really admirable and something that should be defended. And then Enoch, our brilliant head of news, says, I think Starmer has ended up being defined by Labour infighting anyway, thanks to the leak. Well, yes, I remember we talked about this again on Raw News. If we were talking about an issue on Raw News, it means it's defining events in the world. Yes, a leak about anti-Semitism, tens of hundreds, maybe thousands of pages of words into divisions in the Labour Party that's really rocked his leadership and has meant that even though he was trying to break from Jeremy Corbyn's sense of division and infighting. That simply hasn't worked. Anyway, you're listening to Front Page News with me, Noah Keate, here on the Raw News Facebook page and YouTube channel. It's 19 minutes past 10, another time check, and we're going to take a first look at the morning papers today. What are the Monday morning papers saying? The Metro this morning, brilliant free paper if you're ever on a commute, with its coronavirus crisis. It has a lovely photo, locking lips after the lockdown, and it's talking about how Europe is slowly coming back to life following weeks in quarantine. And their picture is a couple stopped to kiss as they walk at the Barcelona beach in Spain. It was because Spain has eased several of its lockdown measures at the weekend during the coronavirus pandemic, and that's really lovely to see. It's very slowly, there are countries like Spain and Italy are very slowly coming out of lockdown. I think they've gone from a complete lockdown to where the UK currently is. So it's almost as though their situation now is our situation at the moment. So it's very slow, but it's lovely to see they're slowly and gradually being able to come out of quarantine. But I mean, I'll probably talk about this later. That doesn't mean life is going to go back to normal in the UK or across Europe. Just because the number of deaths may have decreased per day, that doesn't mean things are going to go back to how they were. Far from it. And then their main front page on the Metro, the world must work together, and a picture of Boris Johnson. And he's saying that countries have to join forces against the virus in a shared endeavour. And then he's having an online conference, apparently, that aims to raise 6.6 billion for a global response. Well, I think this is really important. We have to remember a pandemic is completely international. It's defined by crossing borders and not caring about arbitrary borders that have been made. And that's going to be important if we're going to find a vaccine. And it almost has to be something that will be widely distributed around the world. It can't just be for a few countries. Otherwise, it means that the virus will continue to spread. I do wonder, though, obviously I know I shouldn't talk about Brexit in these times, but whether us leaving the EU or being in the transition period to leave the EU will have helped that. It might have nothing to do with it. The fact that we're outside the EU might not prevent us at all from having a common response to dealing with the pandemic. I wouldn't be surprised if us leaving the EU made that a bit harder, but you can comment down below if you completely disagree with me. The Daily Express this morning still saying they're backing NHS and care heroes, which is brilliant to see. And they got a free VE Day 75th anniversary souvenir pull-out, and you can get a historic collectible edition today and all week. So some brilliant photos there where they put the joy of VE Day in glorious colours, of course, 75 years ago, 1945. And what interests me is that much of our discussion of political history, certainly in the UK, and around the world, is defined by 1945, post-war, post-1945 period. It's when much of the debate is shaped, and it just shows how anniversaries don't go away, even though numerous events across the world have had to be cancelled. Anniversaries where we commemorate and reflect on certain events, like warfare, they don't just suddenly disappear. And then again, they've got a similar story in the Express to the Metro today. PM launching an international mission in a battle for humanity to beat the virus, saying that Boris leads a 6 billion global race for a vaccine. Well, I think a vaccine is going to be important, but we simply don't know the timings for a vaccine. I certainly don't know. Is it something that could happen within weeks, or something that might not take until next year? And if it's not going to take next year, the UK or another country, we can't remain indefinitely in lockdown, can we? Surely we're going to have to go back to some form of, working, although there are more articles about working to come. We can't remain locked down like this for all that time. It's just what sort of, life is that to lead? As I say, I've not been bored in lockdown, certainly not. And I've enjoyed the time to get on with other projects, but I do miss the chance to just go out and about as I did into town, whether it's just going to shopping or losing myself in Waterstones or a museum in Cambridge where I'm based. I do miss those opportunities, and they're things that I reflect back on and think I enjoyed them at the time, but I probably treasure them more if I knew I wasn't going to be able to do them for a long time. So Boris Johnson, it says in the Express that he'll insist that the world can defeat coronavirus together as he drives a push for a virus. So a vaccine, rather, certainly not a virus. Got Freudian slip there. He definitely doesn't want a virus. And that sense of, after he's been back at work now, he was away for 3 weeks, both in intensive care and in recovery, been back at work for a week. And it's a sense he wants to be at the forefront of this global race for vaccine. Of course, I don't know really within the international system where the UK's influence and his influence lies in relation to other nations. Then Richard and Judy, who I know from doing their book club, they said it's ludicrous to keep over 70s in lockdown. Well, I'm not fully sure on this. You might have more details. I don't know whether the guideline is obviously easing from lockdown. It will always be a gradual ease in the UK, but whether it's referring to all over 70s or specifically those that are seen as having underlying health issues. But I spoke before last week about the fact lockdown, that has health implications as well. If you're used to going out and about, being stuck indoors all day, will not be good for either your physical or your mental health, or that sense of social connections with other people. So in a sense, I'd agree with them, but I'm not sure whether from that simplistic headline, the government is planning to say that all over 70s, they'd recommend remain in lockdown, whether just those with specific underlying health issues. But even if they have underlying health issues, that might not be the best answer. And the last paper we'll look at for now, because I've got plenty of other things to talk about, the Daily Telegraph today, they have their regular health on Monday feature at the top saying that cooped up the perils of confinement for our children. Well, yes, I mean, it's going, for the old and the young, being confined all day can be dangerous. One of the things I'm particularly worried about is if young people lose an appreciation for the great outdoors, green space, and being outside with other people. Even before the pandemic, I remember the National Trust used to run this thing, this sort of entity that people should do. I think it's 50 things to do before you're 11 3/4. I don't think I ever did all 50, but it was a way of trying to encourage people to enjoy the outdoors and enjoy communicating with other people. And I worry if young people are suddenly fearful or scared to go outside because they think they'll get the virus. I think this links to a wider concern about the need to balance risk and fear. We want to obviously have safety, but part of being human and part of being a rational human being is understanding risk and teaching people the dangers of risks, but where to assess risk and where it can be reasonable to go outside and communicate with others. And then a football story at the top, which I'll just read out because I don't feel qualified enough to make a statement on it, saying scrap relegation and we'll finish season, say clubs. So if you know more about sport than I do, either comment down below or watch all of our sports coverage here on Raw. And then their main headline today is Johnson again is very much focusing on Boris Johnson. Vaccine is the endeavour of our lives. So it's just that quote, the endeavour is sort of that shared sense of humanity. And it might be another reason why the opinion poll ratings for lots of governments are increasing, because it's that shared, they managed to create that shared unity of people uniting in a certain direction. But the government and governments across the world might get things wrong in their response to the vaccine, which is again why there needs to be some form of opposition holding them to account, ensuring that scientists and other individuals are dealing with it in the right direction. And then there's a story that queues of 1 kilometre might be inexistent to board planes post-lockdown. Well, that's quite worrying, really, if we're having to board. I mean, I think the amount of travel will probably decrease after lockdown, even if people are able to use airports. But queuing, well, we love queuing here in the UK, so I don't think that should be an issue. And then an interesting university story with the Telegraph saying that university student numbers are going to be capped again as Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, unveils a 2.7 billion lifeline. Well, I think the impact on universities from the coronavirus pandemic will be really strong. I've written for the Ball, Warwick's award-winning student newspaper, about the impact of coronavirus on education policy. And we have to remember how sort of the marketisation of education since the days of Margaret Thatcher has shaped the university experience and the school experience. Universities are, in a sense, businesses. They need to invest in companies. They rely on funding from international and domestic students to help fund their research. And that's what universities are meant to be about. They have to balance teaching students, building the skills and knowledge of the next generation, while also being beacons for the pursuit of knowledge and pursuit of the truth. And I think they're both admirable traits, but they're going to suffer, just like all companies are going to suffer. You might have fewer people applying to study in the UK. I think that would be a terrible thing. I think the connection between universities and students from across the world in pursuit of the research, whether it's scientific research or my area, more social sciences, I think that's a brilliant, beautiful thing and something that should be continued. So I'm pleased to hear that the government are going to have some sort of lifeline for universities, because I think they could really struggle to remain financially sustainable. And I think that would be a reason why they've had to introduce a cap on student numbers, because there's a worry that there's sort of be a scramble among universities for any students, because obviously if a university gets a student, that guarantees them money from the government. But of course, it should be about the quality of the student and whether they're the right person for the specific course, rather than simply desiring money from the government. And then some smaller stories on the Telegraph, because as we know, the Telegraph, proper broadsheet newspaper, so they have about 10 different stories on the front page alone. It's just quite remarkable. they're saying that parallel teams and home working will be the new normal. Businesses are advised that this is what will happen. So you might have a team that go in one day, another team the other day, or maybe two teams on the same day, but sort of working different shifts. And then working from home, we need to get used to working from home, doing our work there, and trying not to be distracted. And then other smaller stories saying that Britain may still need Nightingale hospitals. Well, yes, there was certainly the one that was built in Birmingham, or not built, but was sort of opened in Birmingham near Warwick's campus, not too far away from there. I can't remember whether they still have 0 patients. I remember last week they didn't need any patients, but I always thought it was better to be over-prepared rather than under-prepared. But I don't know if since then they've had to rely on people. And then some more news: an antibody test may be approved within days. Well, I think that'd be brilliant. And then a feature from Michael Mosley saying that watching too much television under lockdown isn't ideal. Well, that's not great when, like me, you've just decided to do a few TV reviews, but I love my television. And then some corporate confidence slumps to a record low. Well, businesses and other organisations, I'm not an economist by any stretch of the imagination, but they don't like uncertainty. And certainly this is time, what the one certainty is, it's defined by uncertainty. So there's no wonder that there's a real lack of confidence over the action that they're taking. Some more of your comments. It comes up to exactly 10:30 here on Raw News' Facebook page and YouTube channel. Enoch says, I don't think Starmer has the public presence to successfully hold the government to anything. He's too unknown. Well, yes, and that sort of shows how the pandemic has come at the worst time for him. Even when he was announced as Labour leader, he had to do a pre-recorded video, as did the other two candidates, and that was both defined by his victory, but also defined by how he was, we were in this extraordinary time, and that would inevitably affect his response. So certainly, I don't like the quote after coronavirus, because we just don't know whether we'll ever be after coronavirus fully. That's when he'll need to do sort of more profiles, more interviews, and more media appearances that are defined by things other than the pandemic. Johnny Jenkins says the vaccine could take up to 18 months. Good gosh. Well, I think they're doing trials for something in, what is it? Is it in Oxford University or somewhere where people that have already had the virus? Be careful. Don't rely on me for scientific advice. Don't quote me for anything. This is the disclaimer now that you're getting. You only get this once. They're trying something out, so that's optimistic if it is working. But as I say, 18 months, what do we do till then? Do we carry on working from home or being under lockdown? I just don't see that sustainable for either our health or the economy. I've said before, I don't like the health versus economy debate. I think it's too simplistic, narrow, and ignores other issues, but that can't be good for either of those things, let alone other issues facing the world. Enoch says, I feel like being locked in for half a year is going to make people more desperate than ever for the great outdoors once it's all safe. Well, I hope so too. I hope your optimism is proved right, because I know I've loved my garden. I've loved sort of walking around, going on my attempt at jogging, going to sort of parks and maintaining social distancing there. I know I've loved it, and I hope that other people will as well, and sort of appreciate the need for greenery within our lives. I'm all for, housing developments and the necessity of new council houses being built on greenbelt areas, but at the same time, I think it's important to cherish and aspire towards beautiful cities with beautiful green spaces, which I think somewhere like London does really well. So I'm a big fan of urbanisation and sort of development, and people commuting and moving from rural areas to urban areas. But I think that has to be balanced in with an appreciation for the natural world too. And Alex Elbro, a brilliant Alex Elbro, says, hi Noah, I agree that I avoid the afternoon briefing. No new news, same sound bites every day, follow the science is the latest one they've all been told to say. Well, it's interesting you should say that, Alex. I have on my list of things to talk about, because I do some preparation for this show in case you weren't aware. I wanted to talk about the phrase the science, and I think that's a really nebulous, unclear phrase when the government say they're following the science. And it's been pointed out, I've read before, there's no such thing as the science. It's not some holy book or somewhere where you can look at a text and say this is what is definitely the case. Science is always evolving, and the whole point about science is it can be proved wrong. I think scientists admire if they have a hypothesis, they do some research, they come up with a theory. I think they admire and secretly enjoy when another scientist looks at their theory and proves it wrong, because it shows that their initial theory has been investigated and developed upon. And it's the whole idea, as I say, I'm not a natural scientist, but I think good science should be falsifiable. It should be the case that someone can do something, do an investigation, come up with a deduction, and it can be proved wrong. So this notion that there is simply one body of science to follow, I don't think is accurate or correct. So I think it's important we appreciate it in that context, and therefore that there will be debate within the scientific field. When we have scientists that are present alongside government ministers at briefings, they'll have one interpretation of how the science should work and how the public should respond to it. And then there'll be other scientists that have a different position. And in a way, that's a brilliant thing. The whole point about science is there are obviously some settled things which are agreed upon, but science is supposed to be evolving. And that's what universities are part of that experience. Part of their funding is fantastic laboratories with all the chemicals to try and work out new things and shape research for the future. So I think this approach of just looking at things like the science is incorrect and unreliable. And obviously we don't want the wrong advice. There are some things that are clearly correct. The Earth rotates around the sun. There are some things that are settled, but there are many things within the scientific debate that aren't settled. And probably the lockdown, the correct response to, well, not the lockdown so much, but the response to the virus is one of those. And that links to another thing I've been thinking about, is that I may have spoken about this last week, but ultimately ministers decide. Advisors, scientific advisors, political advisors, they advise, but as the late Lady Thatcher once said, ministers decide. And so I think it's worrying if governments are trying to say they're followed alone by the science, because the scientists that they listen to, can advise them on how the virus is spreading, but they can't advise the government on what action to take. They might say this is the action we would take, but ultimately it's a political response of ministers saying that we believe that we should temporarily shut down the economy to try and prevent the NHS being overwhelmed. That's a political decision to make, and it's not something that scientists will make. They might have their own views, but that's very much their own views on the political response. It's not something that that's ultimately will be decided by politicians who are elected, and it should be decided by politicians because they're the ones who are accountable to the people at future elections. And I think that's the part of their sense of being afraid about the media and the government, sort of the media response to what the government do and the public response, almost being afraid for politicians to take a stance on we're doing this and saying, well, you might disagree, but that's part of governing. Part of living in a liberal democracy is that not everyone can agree, and nor should everyone agree. Great thing about democracy is debate and disagreement, and that should as much be a case in this pandemic as any other point in the political sphere. So I think it's right to say, we shouldn't simply have a one sort of binary approach to how we approach and follow the pandemic. My mug today, you might not be able to read it, but it says happy on it. So I'm trying to feel happy, even though the UK is entering its seventh week of lockdown, but the tea is keeping me very happy. Now I want to take a quick break from coronavirus, you'll be pleased to hear, and talk about my book recommendation this week. And I've chosen, I'll just get it because it's slightly out of shot, Decline and Fall by Evelyn, or is it Evelyn? Evelyn or Evelyn Waugh. This is his first novel. It's a brilliant fiction book that I read about a year and a half ago, and it's really wry and amusing. It follows the adventures of Paul Pennyfeather, who goes to work in a Welsh boarding school, and I just found it really funny and adventurous, and it sort of has that, even though it was written before Enid Blyton's Adventures of sort of Mallory Towers, or J.K. Rowling writing about Hogwarts as a sort of boarding school. It has a very engaging and witty approach to life in a boarding school, and the sort of horror of being a schoolmaster or being in charge of pupils. And so he leaves Oxford in sort of strange circumstances. He's expelled, I think, from his college, and so to make money and make a living, he has to go down to Wales, where he meets the strange sort of headmaster called Mr. Fagin. And I won't spoil the plot, but it's very, very, very amusing and really worth your time. I think it is. It's published by Penguin Classics, so his novels, Evelyn Waugh's, both Decline and Fall, and future novels are defined as sort of classics of our time that are everlasting. I think this was published in 1928. It's nearly almost 100 years ago in just a few years' time, and it's still as relevant today. It's written very, very well. It involves sort of love, intrigue, prison, mystery, mischief, and tales of adventure and wonder. So I really, really enjoyed it when I read it. I remember reading it on coaches or in hotel rooms or wherever for about 5 days or so, and it ends very well in a sort of shocking way. And I've read 2 more of Evelyn's work since. I've read Brideshead Revisited, which I know has been adapted for television, and I enjoyed that, and that's maybe more well known than his first book, Decline and Fall, but I didn't enjoy it as much. And I've also read Scoop by him, which is about journalism, so maybe I should have chosen that one instead of this. But Decline and Fall, definitely a really, really great read, and very sort of accessible characters. And I think when reading it, important to remember it was of its time. It was in 1928, so certain things that would be sort of unacceptable now to you're seen as socially disapproved within literature now was more acceptable then, and vice versa. It was just a completely different period. It was another world, but that's the point of classics. They might be in another world, but the words within them are still as relevant and engaging today. So I think I love my non-fiction books. I love my political non-fiction books. And of course, I could say that this fiction book has political elements within it. But, I mean, for me, everything is political. The personal is political. But for this, it was a really, really great fiction read. I love fiction, just that sense of escapism. And I certainly got that from this. And I think the important thing with fiction books is I might not remember the entire plot of them for either this book or other fiction books, or maybe I just have a bad memory. But the important thing is the feeling you have when reading it, and that sort of memory of joy when you finish the book or finish a particular chapter. And I know I certainly got that with this fiction book. It's just really, 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 really great fun, really, and really sort of witty too. So it's something that I definitely recommend. Some more of your comments. So this is the, I think, beautiful front cover as well. I know books shouldn't be defined by a front cover or what sort of quotes are on the back and which people recommend them. But for me, they sort of invariably are. If I like a front cover, then that would make me more likely to look at the book and have a look within. And I'm very glad I did for this one. So like him, along with all the great sort of classic fiction writers, I now want to read all of his books, which I'll probably get round to. Maybe if we are in lockdown for 18 months, because that's how long it takes to find a vaccine, maybe I will get around to reading all of his books. Who knows? I'll just have to order them off Waterstones or even Amazon Shock Horror. I'll take a look at some more of your comments of what you've been saying. Alex says, oh no, I think I've read that one. Enoch says, the head of news, I had to listen to the afternoon broadcast. It's a miserable experience. Well, I'm deeply sorry to hear that, Enoch. I mean, I know you're being kept up to speed, but I imagine the fact it's daily, it's weird in the sense the government almost can't win either way. If they didn't do it daily, people would say this is a international pandemic. It's something that needs to be discussed daily. But even though the fact they do it daily, it means that there are very few developments, probably apart from the daily death toll and the continued government response and advice, which has sort of been drilled into us day after day after day. And then Alex says she finds that deeply, she feels Enoch's pain and finds it very frustrating. Jenny Millett-Brown says all parties must put aside their differences and work together to contain the virus and safely get us out of lockdown. Pleased that there are indicators of this happening. When we get out of lockdown, we want to stay out. It's a great care must be taken to achieve this. Great programme, Noah. Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. Well, I agree, and that's the worry about coming into full lockdown too early, this notion that we come out of lockdown and then people that were together that hadn't, or one person had the virus and the other person didn't, they'd pass it on, and then there could potentially be a second peak. So you're right, we do want to avoid that. And that's why I think when the UK does come out of lockdown, it will be very much a gradual process and we won't rush into it, which could be the right decision. But I think, as I said earlier, we have to balance sort of fear of something and the risk of it happening with the realistic chance of happening, and having to, carry on living and trying to enjoy some sense of, an enjoyable life. But I mean, that could be I could do a whole hour, a whole day to philosophical discussion of what makes an enjoyable life, but this is not the place for that. Alex says, exactly, as a scientist and engineer in my original career, I didn't know that, it's so frustrating. Interesting they choose to ignore all experts when they choose, such as Brexit. Well, it's interesting. We remember Michael Gove's infamous phrase, people have had enough of experts. Now, in his defence, I'm not usually one to defend Michael Gove, but I think he was specifically referring to experts like the CBI or ones with acronyms in their names. So maybe not all experts. But you're right, definitely very much the majority of economic and other opinions were that we should remain within the EU. But in a sense, from that, we now have some certainty. We have left. We're sort of in the transition period. There is now more uncertainty about whether the transition period is extended. I think it should be. I think if we could, deadlines bring decisions, but it might not be a good decision if we have the arbitrary deadline of the 31st December. I think there was some polling, I can't remember exactly where, that said quite a high proportion of Brexiteers and even Leave voters who so backed Boris Johnson's government last December, they'd be quite happy or quite relaxed about a 6-month extension. I think they realised how the coronavirus pandemic is a cliche, but it has changed everything, and I think it has to be assessed in that way. And Alex says, if the science is black and white, why have so many countries done completely different things? Well, exactly. You've seen a real variation between countries like South Korea, places like Taiwan, as well as the UK, and even places like the United States, and where United States, where Donald Trump, and Brazil, where Mr. Bolsonaro, they seem to be defying the science, or the science, defying scientific advice from their advisors, and openly not taking part in a proper way to try and prevent the virus affecting as many people as it is, because this is far more than just the ordinary cold or the common flu that we're used to at this time of year. Obviously we don't shut down our entire economy because of the flu or the cold, but this is something that's so much worse than that. It is on another scale. And I remember sort of in February and March, I was very concerned about alarmism, and I didn't want alarmism or hysteria within any sort of discussion about the coronavirus. But I don't think it's alarmist to say that this is something far beyond the flu and the cold, with a death toll of nearly 250,000 globally. Even if people haven't died of the coronavirus, the fact they've died with COVID-19 shows how damaging it is. And Cam Hall, who hosts The Alternative View, he did his debut show last Tuesday at 3 p.m. It's really, really great. And I think he's doing another one tomorrow at 3 p.m. So it's really worth your time. He says, great show, Noah. Going back to the daily broadcast, do governments have ulterior motives for them, especially a criticism that Trump's are being utilised as campaign rallies? Well, quite, I'd agree. I think in the UK, it seems as though they've sort of, conceded to public pressure for doing maybe daily press conferences. So hence, you really got a mixture of different ministers doing it. Boris Johnson initially, but then when he was unable to serve, other ministers taking the role. And that's for Donald Trump. I don't think he stopped campaigning ever since he entered the White House on the 20th of January 2017. He's very much a campaigning individual. Someone like him, Donald Trump, and someone on a very different scale like Dominic Cummings, who's the Prime Minister's senior advisor. These people are clearly effective and successful at running campaigns and winning results. Of course, for Donald Trump, as I don't need to remind you, he didn't actually win the popular vote in 2016. But the real difference is that you can campaign, you can be a great campaigner and awful in government. And what we're seeing from the UK government is, there was initially at first a real lack of focus over the correct direction. You are listening to Front Page with me, Noah Keate, here on the Raw News Facebook page and YouTube channel. It's already 10:45, can you believe? I've barely got through a fraction of what I wanted to talk about today, but we'll take a look at some more of the morning papers. The Times today says, sick of Zoom, you've got 6-week syndrome. I don't know what the six-week syndrome is, but I have used Zoom quite a few times over the last 6 weeks, and I'm certainly not bored of it yet. I think it's because I'm using it in the context of pleasure. I'm choosing to join all these great talks and go to these brilliant online events that are talking about coronavirus and the different angles to it. So maybe because I'm doing it more for pleasure rather than work, I have got a different approach to it. But I partially like Zoom because it's so easy to use. So for someone like me who's hardly a wonder with technology, it makes it a lot easier to enjoy the experience. And only a few times has my internet connection cut out, as people in the Zoom call will tell you. Again, focusing on the Prime Minister today, vaccine is the only way to beat the virus. And the Prime Minister has delayed his plan to kickstart the economy until Sunday. Well, I think initially it was on Thursday there was going to be some sort of announcement about the exit strategy, even though it wasn't a precise date for when the UK would leave lockdown. They had at least announced a way that this would take place. It's the fact that this has been delayed until Sunday. I think it was so the Prime Minister could look at more evidence and more advice from these advisors. Well, he cannot delay indefinitely. People will soon want to know, even if they're happy to remain in lockdown for the foreseeable future, they'll at least want to know how the government is planning to get the country out of lockdown, hopefully, in my case, in the near future. And then there's a photo of a model rehearsing in Beijing, but she's wearing a mask. So it shows the modelling industry, every industry that you just think, how on earth could this be related to the coronavirus pandemic, is being related to it in some way. And then a very important education story. thousands of A-level pupils have been given no work by their teachers. According to Nicola Woodcock, the education correspondent for The Times, a quarter of A-level students preparing to go to university are not being given any work to do by their schools, according to research. Well, I think this is very worrying. I know that I am personally very glad I didn't take a gap year, a 3-month holiday after I finished my exams in June last year before starting university in September. That was more than enough time for me to relax and, go abroad and enjoy leisure activities. So the fact that many pupils might be going 6 months without doing any work at all, any sort of preparation, I think will be very worrying. Obviously, I think students do have the chance to sit exams in the autumn, presuming that the lockdown and social distancing comes to some closure. They have the chance to sit exams in the autumn, but until then, what are many doing? And of course, some may have been given work by teachers, but that doesn't necessarily mean they can access the work. Some people, I'm very lucky to have a computer. Some people might be doing work on their phones. They might have limited internet access. So there's a whole sort of structural issues in place that affect what work people can do, and therefore their access to education and the quality of it which they receive. And one of the things about education was it was meant to be regardless of your wealth, that you can have some form of education. The Eye this morning, lots of different stories on its front page. The main story, Britain to get back to work, and then they have a whole series of news stories underneath it saying that there are guidelines on return to some workplaces that have been sent to employers and unions, but some offices will remain closed for months. Well, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I don't know how much it costs to rent an office space, but surely if you're in London in particular, it must be a vast amount of money, and clearly a key part of the money a company makes will be spent on office space. I wouldn't be surprised if some move permanently towards working from home and then occasionally renting out a room for, say, an afternoon if they needed some kind of strategy meeting. Working hours apparently are going to be staggered with possible one-way systems in stations. Well, I mean, that just to me sounds like a nightmare. I just have visions of it going completely wrong. I mean, I have quite an idyllic attitude towards stations because I've been very lucky to have never needed to use a train for my commute. Unlike many people at my sixth form college, I've always been within walking distance of my education institution. So hence I've only used stations on holiday. So I think that if I ever have to use a station in the future, my attitude towards it might change. There are fears of an avalanche of traffic as Britons avoid public transport. Well, I would have thought that the coronavirus pandemic within the future, I'd have thought that would hopefully increase sort of access to public transport. But yes, I wouldn't be surprised if car usage does sadly increase. I'm a big fan of buses, coaches, trams, trains, and all kinds of public transport. But that could maybe go into reverse if people are too fearful about being near other people, even if there is some form of social distancing. Number 10 revealing further measures later this week. But the Welsh and Scottish governments apparently clash with Number 10 as government insiders tell the iPaper that Nicola Sturgeon is using the crisis to further the independence cause. Well, I must say I have been disappointed with the SNP government for quite a while, ever since the result of the 2014 independence referendum. Instead of accepting that the people of Scotland voted to remain in the UK and accept that the extra devolution powers that have been handed to the Scottish Parliament, it seems that the Scottish government have just been insistent on relating everything to independence instead of governing Scotland, and that's led to a sort of damning verdict on their premiership, not least in health and education. And for other news, return of the Scotty dog, apparently. I'm more of a cat person personally. An exclusive from the Eye, UK carbon emissions are down 36%. Well, yes, that is one of the sort of positive, in inverted commas, things about the coronavirus pandemic. By shutting down our economy, unsurprisingly, the environment has benefited from this, but it's, what a cost it's had to take for the carbon emissions to be reduced. And I think it's really going to affect the environmental debate within the future because, I want clean energy, I want renewable energy, I want lots of things, but it shouldn't need to take shutting down the economy entirely and thousands of deaths for us to have a sustainable future. So I think the debate needs to turn to how we can value humanity and the ingenuity of humanity. We can value protecting the economy, but also at the same time dealing with the environment in a sustainable manner. So whether that's a mixture of renewable energy, nuclear fusion, nuclear energy, I think that's all part of the debate that has to be had, because we can't have it where it takes the shutting down of our economy and living such lives, such sort of frugal, basic lives indoors, to cope with, to help the environment. That shouldn't need to be the case. And then finally, for now, the Financial Times saying proposed workplace rules include staggered shifts and separations, priority of social distancing, with unions helping to draft the guidelines, but with smaller companies fearing the costs. Well, I wouldn't be surprised. I think the governments around the world can only do so much. And I really have so much sympathy with different companies that, in my local Mill Road, there are so many small independent companies that have had to close. They're bedrock to the community. And for many, I'm sure it's unclear whether they're going to reopen because the government can only do so much. I think it's so unfair for businesses that were either making a profit or were profitable. They were going to survive. They've been shut down because of government enforced measures, and they're now sort of unable to trade and perhaps unable to receive any kind of help. And even if they're able to reopen, it'll only be at a fraction of the original cost. Lots of other stories on the Financial Times, like the Daily Telegraph, they really cover their front page in huge amounts of bits. China recovery, tourist sites pull in visitors. Well, I'm not sure if that's related to the pandemic or not, or something different. The debt debate, government spending poses no danger. Well, I hope it doesn't, because our debt, even in the UK alone, is 2 trillion. It's a ridiculous amount of debt that we're in beforehand. It was really bad before the pandemic, and with the announcements of these hundreds of billions spent on helping the country, the deficit, I'm not sure what that is, but the debt is an astronomical amount. And that's going to be paid back for, unfortunately, by our generation. Our generation over decades may have higher taxes and see more money going to the government to try and pay these measures that we now live in. Now it's coming up to 10:54 here on Front Page News, here on the Raw News Facebook page and YouTube channel. And I can't believe we're nearly out of time. But before we go, I, of course, want to recommend my podcast of the week. And I want to recommend today the How to Fail podcast with Elizabeth Day. And this is a really enjoyable podcast with Elizabeth Day, who used to, I think, work for the Observer, Daily Telegraph, Evening Standard, acclaimed journalist, where every week, or most weeks, because there's sometimes a break between series, she interviews a famous, successful person who's very honest and open about 3 failures within their lives. It might be fairly trivial things, or may seem trivial, like failing their driving test, but it allows them to open up about where their lives have gone wrong. And most importantly, it shows how they've used their failures initially within life to help them achieve their successes in the future, and teach them about how, even though something can go wrong, it's not a hindrance in life, and they're very resilient about what they do. And I think that's really important in this day and age. I know social media is so much based around success and likes and clicks, and it very much presents an artificial picture of our real lives. I know I try to, on social media, I've tried to be a little bit amusing, a little bit wry, but obviously for everyone, that's a filter of the true lives that we lead. And so these sort of celebrities, famous people, maybe even influencers, if you dare to use that word, they're very honest about where they've gone wrong in life. And she's had such an eclectic range of guests, from the LBC presenter James O'Brien to Alistair Campbell, who was an advisor to Tony Blair, to Phoebe Waller-Bridge of Fleabag fame, and to Andrew Scott, also of Fleabag fame and Sherlock fame too. There's a real mixture of guests who would seem on the surface highly successful, but have actually had many failures within their lives. So I think that authenticity and raw honesty is both highly important, and it's got lovely theme music, and it's humorous as well. It doesn't make a virtue out of things going wrong and life being terrible, but it's all about how we can become stronger and grow more successful from things going wrong. And many of their failures will be different to the rest of ours, but it's that sense of, despite the difference, there's a sense of universalism. Even though we all live completely different lives, we all fail, we all have the opportunity to succeed as well. So I think there are about 60, when I looked earlier today, about 67 episodes to enjoy during lockdown. But Elizabeth Day, really great questions and great sort of clarity over where life has gone wrong for these people, because sometimes it's just something that needs to be discussed. My tweeter of the week is Stig Abel, who is the editor of the Times Literary Supplement. Now, that might sound quite dry and boring. I know for me, the Times Literary Supplement, when I read it, can appear inaccessible first, but does become more enjoyable. But I really like his Twitter page. It's one of the ones I really enjoy seeing on my timeline because of his range of different tweets. He might tweet about a government story, like he tweeted about the government testing announcements on Friday, where the government had announced that they'd met their testing target. And he made the interesting point that it's possible to believe the government have done well in increasing the number of tests from 128,000 earlier, back earlier in April. They've both been successful, but also slightly misleading in how they reported their 122,000 tests, because that had included tests which had been sent home but not necessarily returned and completed. And so it's that nuance of tweets, and that there's no sense of tribalism from him. It's a real, he'd be willing to criticise the government and the opposition, but does so in a way that really makes you think more about the political issues of our time. And he also promotes articles from the Times literary supplement, some of which I've been able to read, the ones in front of a paywall, which when I've, I may not have read the book that they're reviewing, but it allows me to think about literature and ideas in a different way. And also sometimes, like the best tweeters, he'll tweet about his personal life, which is really lovely and amusing to see. And he's part of a new radio station that's launching, another radio station called Times Radio, that's launching in the summer and looks to be a really interesting listen. But of course, only listen to that when Raw 12:51 AM is off air. You'd never want to listen to it otherwise. But he's co-presenting the weekday breakfast show, which sounds like it'll be a really good listen and maybe an alternative to other stations that we're used to listening to. So him for Twitter, the How to Fail podcast with Elizabeth Day, and then Decline and Fall by Evening War are my cultural recommendations for today. But I can't believe we're almost coming to the end of the show. And before I go, the CMP movie says we need a massive stimulus to boost the economy, then high tax on large businesses and the wealthy to help us pay it off. Well, I do think tax are going to have to go up, especially I would say corporation tax maybe. I think it should go back up to 26%, which I think is what it was under Gordon Brown. I'd happily increase that. But at the same time, I think there needs to be really big incentives to smaller businesses, small and medium-sized businesses, which are the backbone both of an economy and also of a community, because I think we need to restore that sense of social interaction we do outside, not to be afraid of being near other people, but celebrating, in proportion, using rationality, celebrating communication and being with other people. And that will be done through brilliant small and medium-sized businesses, which might only be an independent business in an area, but they are the backbone of an economy, and they really help to make what civilization is. So thank you for that. Thank you for all your comments today. The show has whizzed by. I've hardly talked about anything that I wanted to discuss, but thanks to your comments, the papers, and a bit of culture, we've had, I think, a really well-rounded discussion. I've enjoyed it a lot. Do make sure that you stay tuned to the Raw News Facebook page and YouTube channel, because we have such a great range of content and debate coming up. It's really worth your time. I know I've enjoyed listening to it, and it's made me think about issues in a different way. I'll be back with you next Monday morning, hopefully, definitely, from 10 AM for more discussion, more culture, more reviews, and more opinions. So I hope you'll join me then. It's been lovely having your company today. Have a brilliant week. But until then, thanks for watching. Stay safe and well, and goodbye.